observational studies. Remember that in observational studies, there's no intervention involved. The researchers are simply observing what is happening and collecting data. This means that we can't assess causality. Descriptive studies are the simplest type of observational research design. In a descriptive study, researchers collect data about one or more variables, generally at a single time point. Now, unlike other study designs, descriptive study designs don't require a clear hypothesis prior to the onset of the study. In fact, these studies are often for generating hypotheses. Usually they're done when a researcher has noticed an effect that they're interested in, but they're not quite sure what's causing it yet. Now, one thing to note is that because descriptive studies don't have as clear of a structure, since they don't start off with a clear hypothesis, they have a more limited ability for quantitative analysis. I'll be using these pictograms a lot to describe these different types of research designs. So let me just remind you that the red people have the outcome of interest, the purple people do not have the outcome, and then the people with the glow around them, which I will highlight in green, have an exposure of interest. Although again, because this is a descriptive study, we may not necessarily know what that exposure is yet. The first type of descriptive study is the case report or the case series. We'll discuss these together because they're very similar. In a case report, a researcher selects a single individual based on some factor of interest. Often this is a disease that the researcher is studying. The researcher then records a detailed description of the patient and their disease course in order to hopefully get some information about potential relevant risk factors or exposures. A case series is exactly like a case report, but instead of recruiting just one patient, the researcher recruits multiple patients with the same diagnosis. And the hope here is to describe these patients and see if we can find anything in common, like a common exposure that may be leading to the outcome that we're seeing. For example, a study like this describing a group of young men with a rare form of cancer called Kaposi sarcoma helped lead to the discovery of HIV. The nice thing about case reports and case series is because you're only collecting data on one person or just a few people, you can collect quite a rich data set, and it doesn't require a lot of time or a lot of money. However, a major limitation of these studies is that they lack a control group. This means that you can't effectively compare exposure rates between your group of people with the outcome that you're interested in and without the outcome. And because there's no control group or hypothesis, there's relatively little quantitative analysis that you can do. Another really important thing to consider is because you're only selecting one participant or a few participants, it's very likely that your sample of patients that you're studying is not representative of the general population with your disease of interest. So with just one or a few patients, you may have selected only, say, people of a certain age or people of a certain socioeconomic background. And that's not going to be representative of how the disease manifests itself in a population with more variety of people. Let's move on to cross-sectional studies. These are quite commonly tested because they're easily confused with other types of observational studies. The easiest way to tell them apart is to remember that cross-sectional studies are conducted at a single time point. They ask what is happening in the population right now. Participants can either be selected as an entire population or as a sample of your population of interest. And then data on one or more variables is collected. So this can be just data on the outcome of interest, just data on an exposure, or data on both. So for example, researchers might want to count how many people are diagnosed with asthma in a population. So in our population of interest over here, we have 4 people that are diagnosed with asthma. And the number of people that is diagnosed with a disease at a certain point in time is called the prevalence. So one thing to remember is that a quantitative analysis that is possible for cross-sectional studies is determining the prevalence. However, since these studies are done at a single time point only, they can't be used to evaluate incidence, which is the number of new diagnoses that occur during a time period. And they can't be used to evaluate risk, which is the probability of developing a certain outcome based on your exposure history. We'll talk about this more in future videos, but for now just remember that cross-sectional studies can be used to calculate prevalence and not a whole lot else. I want to make a couple distinctions here that are not super important to remember for test day, but will hopefully help you understand and distinguish these studies a little bit better. So the first is that cross-sectional studies can be conducted with or without a hypothesis in mind before starting. So in our asthma example from before, we were simply counting how many patients were diagnosed with asthma in a population without thinking about what exposures might be driving those outcomes. This is an example of a descriptive study. However, remember that in a cross-sectional study, we can measure more than one variable. So we can assess both the number of people in a population with asthma, but we can also assess, say, the number of people in a population with exposure to secondhand smoke. So in our sample population, we have 6 people with no exposure to secondhand smoke and no asthma. We have 2 people with exposure to secondhand smoke and no asthma. We have 1 person with no exposure to secondhand smoke and asthma. And we have 3 people with exposure to secondhand smoke and asthma. This example, where we're looking at both an exposure and an outcome that we've hypothesized prior to conducting the study, makes this type of cross-sectional study an analytical study. Generally, boards questions won't ask you to categorize something into a descriptive or an analytical study, but it's just something to help you categorize all of these studies in your mind. Now, another point that can be confusing is I've talked a lot about how cross-sectional studies are done at a single time point, but they can be done as a series of cross-sectional studies. So for example, we could run our study counting how many people have asthma in a population in, say, the year 2000, the year 2005, and the year 2010. Even though the entire research study as a whole is taking place over the course of several years, each individual data point represents only one point in time. So it's still a cross-sectional study. On the other hand, if we were assessing a group of people and following individuals over time from, say, 2000 when they were first exposed to secondhand smoke to 2005 when they developed asthma, that would no longer be a cross-sectional study because one study participant's data set represents more than one time point. These last 2 points about analytical versus descriptive study designs and studies that are done as a series also apply to ecological studies, which is the last study design I'll talk about in this video. In ecological studies, participants are selected as entire populations, and then the average value of one or more variables across entire populations is measured. So if we take our entire population here, we see that 75% of the people have the outcome of interest and 75% of the people have the exposure of interest. This is typically useful for quickly comparing 2 different populations. So for example, we could compare averages across this green population and averages across this purple population. An example of this might be looking at levels of air pollution in 2 cities and also looking at rates of cancer diagnoses in both cities. Often these studies can be done using publicly available databases, so they can be quite easy and cheap to do. However, conclusions drawn from these studies can often fall victim to the ecological fallacy, which is when data collected on a population level is applied to the individual level. So just because, for example, there's more air pollution in city A than city B, and there's higher rates of cancer in city A and city B, that doesn't mean that a single individual from city A is more likely to get cancer than an individual from city B, because there are other variables that are related to cancer diagnosis that our population level analysis didn't take into account in our ecological study. I want to finish this video by highlighting what I think are some of the most distinctive components of each of these studies, so you can easily identify them from a question stem on test day. So for a case report or a case series, you can usually identify these based on the very small number of participants. And I've already pointed out that if a research study occurs only at a single time point, that's often a clue that it's a cross-sectional study. And finally, if a research study is collecting data on entire populations and not individuals, that's likely going to be an ecological study.